So this album comes in at number 86 on Best Ever Albums list, top albums of the 70s, number 15 in 1971, and 327 of all time. It also comes in at number 233 in Rolling Stone's list of the top 500 albums of all time. So we previously covered John Lennon on his first solo album, Plastic Ono Band, Season 2, Episode 5 of Combing the Stacks. And you can basically go back to, create a list of all of the Season 1 episodes and throw a dart at it, and chances are you're going to hit a Beatles episode that we did. So we covered a lot of Beatles in the 60s.
Fair point.
Yeah. The album was recorded from February to July of 1971, and it was released on September 9th, 1971. It was co-produced, again, by John Lennon, Yoko Ono, and Phil Spector, just like the first album. And many of these songs were actually written, at least in part, while Lennon was in the Beatles in 1968 and 1969. Some of these were, parts of songs that he had written while the band was in India. And so he was, used this as an opportunity to finish up some of those ideas that never made it to a Beatles record. Some of the musicians included on this record included George Harrison, who played the dobro, slide guitar, and electric guitar. A name that we've come up with a couple of times here, Klaus Voormann, who was a bass player. He played with John Lennon before. He was also on George Harrison's All Things Must Pass, and a friend of the band from their days back in Hamburg. Nicky Hopkins makes another appearance. This guy's all over the place. He's on the piano here.
CTS HOF, baby.
No doubt. Alan White, who was was soon to be the new drummer of Yes. He's on most of the drums here, but except for one track on the song "It's So Hard," Jim Gordon is the drummer, and I don't know if either of you guys remember that name, but he was the drummer from Derek and the Dominos. And finally, King Curtis, who plays the saxophone. There's a couple of saxophone parts on here, and King Curtis plays on that. Interesting and very tragic note that comes along with this. He was actually murdered. He was stabbed to death a month before the release of this record. He apparently got into some sort of altercation while he was going into his apartment with a drug dealer on the street, and they got into he was trying to bring his air conditioner up to the apartment, and the guy wouldn't get out of the way, and then next thing you know, he's got stabbed to death at the age of 37. So this was probably one of his final performances. So the album was a critical and commercial success. It peaked at number 1 in both the US and the UK. Recording took place mostly at Lennon's home in Tittenhurst Park, which is this huge estate in the middle of nowhere in England. There was some recording that was also done in New York City. He invites many, of the musicians over to hang out. There's also a number of photographers, videographers, and journalists that are invited as well. And there's a lot of footage that's recorded here, and you can actually see this in a recent documentary that came out on Netflix called Above Us Only Sky. So that was kind of an interesting way just to see how they were interacting and recording this record. The studio is actually attached to the house, so they just, there's scenes where they're just kind of hanging out, drinking tea and just talking, and all of a sudden it's like, all right, let's just go next door to the studio, and they just, go over and start, recording the record. So we've talked a lot about, how much, John Lennon and the Beatles influenced and started, new things, like when they created heavy metal, like when, they, you started using feedback in music, and also when they basically invented the music video, all those things that they did. But we have another kind of quasi-invention here, which is the diss track, which you kind of heard on the montage. This has one of the first diss tracks you'll ever hear. And so that's kind of it's notable for that, right? Because this was a time when Lennon and McCartney were not getting along. Lennon writes "How Do You Sleep" in retaliation to McCartney for what he was writing in the album Ram, which we covered earlier as well. But this was much more in your face, calling McCartney out and basically saying that the music that he does now is muzak to his ears. It also includes Lennon's signature song, "Imagine." I'm very curious about your takes on this song because it's been hailed as one of the best songs of all time. Rolling Stone ranked it number 3 in the top 500 songs of all time. It was also credited with an award for for the best song of the century. Or song of the century as well, but a number of other people felt that it was very, self-indulgent. It was preachy. It was hypocritical. and schmaltzy. So there's definitely two camps on that song, but it is pretty much his. I think it's safe to say that you can make the argument that is his biggest song. And since 2005, it's actually played before the ball drops in Times Square on New Year's Eve. So I have a couple of different reviews here. I don't really want to get into that right now. I'm kind of more interested in your thoughts, but that's essentially it. There's not a ton of other things behind this. I can say that even with Phil Spector producing it, it's definitely even though it's a more produced album than his debut album, Plastic Ono Band. It's still pretty raw and vulnerable at parts, but it's certainly a little bit more of a polished record. And I think Lennon was going for a little bit more commercial success than his debut album. So those sounds that you hear in this record are intentional like that. So, all right. So let's start with John. I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are on this record.
So it's funny because we were talking about the earlier albums, like the earlier Beatles albums, like Ram by Paul McCartney and All Things Must Pass by George Harrison, as sort of harbingers of modern indie or later indie, right? Like that was when I was hearing this album. This sounded like an indie album, that could come from the 90s or the 00s, right? Especially the last track. The song to Yoko,
yes.
That was the song that could have been like an indie rock song in the 2000s. It very much sounded. I was thinking of all the different bands it could have been from the 2000s. But I like this album. I don't know if I liked it as much as the rawness of the earlier Lennon album that we did, the Plastic Ono Band.
Yep.
But there is still a lot to like about this. The songwriting is still strong. I'd be curious, Matt. We don't really have Lennon after this, do we? And
nope.
Is it kind of considered that these are his two magnum opus? Magnum opus. Excuse me, I don't know why I can't speak right now. Because I don't really, I kind of like after 71, right? He kind of gets to 80, and he's just sort of floating around. It feels like
he does a couple. He's doing some more records, but then he does take a hiatus from. His son Sean is born in 1975, and. He agrees to basically stay home for like 5 years and doesn't create any music. So,
and then was just going back into the studio, right?
Yep.
When tragedy struck. Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
Okay. So that answers a question of what I had. But yeah, I like this album. I liked the production of this album stood out to me. I liked the tightness of the songs. Once again, I really like where John Lennon went after the Beatles. It's very clear to see what each of the Beatles wanted to do, as we talked about last week. And Lennon clearly wanted to write confessional, sort of... he veers between very confessional tracks and very world introspective tracks on this album, whereas the last one was, as we said, it was basically a therapy session the entire time. He's got pieces of this, but it's not as raw on this one, and the music is not as harsh either. And it brings you in a little bit more, not as much as the McCartney album or even the Harrison album did. But with that being said, I didn't quite like it as much as Plastic Ono Band, because that felt like Lennon was sort of emptying his gun. Or whatever Lennon was he was doing. So obviously, that doesn't go with
primal screaming.
Now, where do I stand on Imagine? It's like one of those things that it kind of went from being celebrated to viewed as schlocky, and now it's kind of going back the other way, that everybody shits on it so much. I almost feel like now it's forgotten that it was a song at one time that was a good song that kind of became, schlocky, right? Because it was used in everything. So I kind of say, like, it's crazy to say this, but I'm kind of neutral on that song. I can appreciate that it's a very idealistic song. I really like the piano in it and how it builds. But yeah, it's kind of like, it's hard to not think of it as like a TV commercial too, which I'm sure would make Lennon go insane. So so I'm kind of neutral on that, believe it or not. But yeah, I would say, and I'm interested to hear each of your takes on this, but I would say I like this. It's much more of a guitar-driven album to me as well, outside of Imagine, obviously, which I liked. I liked some of the guitar parts. I liked the edge, especially on the back end. It's another album that I like the back end of the album more than I like the front end of the album, I think.
Okay. Josh?
I found this album solid, but not as interesting or as mind-blowing as Plastic Ono Band was for me. Commercial is definitely the way to describe this album, because it's, like John said, it's less confessional. I think it's a more upbeat sounding album. I mean, with a song like Imagine, you could say it's a more hopeful album, even though he does do the diss track on How Do You Sleep, and there's some darker things in here, but nowhere near as dark as what Plastic Ono Band had. I noticed the production, Phil Spector's production on this, a lot more than I did on Plastic Ono Band for some reason. Mm-hmm. And that wasn't a positive for me this time around. I guess despite, we've listened to a lot of Phil Spector at this point, or it seems like we have. He's always sticking his fingers in things, and I don't like it on this album as much. I'd be interested to see kind of what a different production would have brought to this album, or maybe just stripped down and not as much wall of sound stuff that he brings to it. I feel like there's a little bit of like echo quality to this on some of the songs. There's just not as much. I didn't hear a lot of like multiple types of instruments and things that Spector's adding to it. So I don't know what he really brought to it if he doesn't do that. It would seem like Lennon could work with anybody he wanted to at this point, or producer wise. So I don't know what, I guess Phil Spector is one of the more famous producers. But that being said, I thought it was a good use of he's bringing like the blues back into his songs. He's bringing the piano heavy songs back into it, and I like the use of strings in some of these songs too, like How Do You Sleep. And my favorite song is Oh Yoko, which is from the Rushmore soundtrack also, which is one of my favorite movies. That's probably where I heard it, but I hadn't heard this album before other than Imagine and Oh Yoko. And it does strike me that it does seem like remnants of other songs or Beatles songs. It doesn't seem as complicated. I don't think lyrically this album is bringing anything new or groundbreaking to his music. And yeah, it's just kind of a solid listen. It flies by, but I thought Plastic Ono Band is much more worthwhile, like unpacking. There's much more to unpack in Plastic Ono Band is what I'm saying. As far as Imagine the song goes, gosh, it's been appropriated so much. I remember that stupid version they did during the pandemic with all the celebrities.
Oh, with Gal Gadot.
Yeah, that was the most recent blasphemy. So I think I think this song has probably lost some of its power and originality that it had at the beginning when it was released. So it's hard to not. It's also very short. It feels almost unfinished because you hear it and then I think he's going to keep going and then just wraps up and ends. Mm-hmm. So I mean, that's good in some respects because it's still only 3 minutes, but and it's a beautiful song in some ways. I like him on the piano in it, but I just don't think it. People need to give the song a rest after a while and rediscover it, I think. So yeah, I like this album, not as much as Plastic Ono Band. It's sad that he didn't make more albums after this. I was wondering if there was going to be more stuff we had to listen to. It seemed like, well, what you were saying with him going back into the studio, he had a lot more, I'm sure, to.
Well, he did do. I think there's like 2 that came out after this, and then he did Double Fantasy with Yoko in 1980. Oh. So there's more. I mean, there's more albums out there. He definitely did more, but these were the 2 that, made the list that we're covering. So
gotcha. And the more famous of the rest of this grouping of albums.
Well, I mean, the other albums certainly have hits on it. Songs that would certainly be recognizable. But these are the ones that just like every other a lot of other albums that we cover, some make the list and some don't. Yep. Josh, what did you say? Like you didn't think he was as what'd you say, confessional on this record as the first one? What was the?
Yeah.
Was that it? Okay. Yeah, I see what you're saying, but I was kind of thinking about this because I think that sonically, this is certainly a much more produced album. It's a more, and it's a poppier record. It's an easier listen, right? It's not as harsh. I definitely think that a lot of the lyrics, though, there's a lot of confessional stuff on here still. I don't think he's totally abandoning it. When you're looking at something like when you look at something like "Jealous Guy" or "Oh My Love" or "How," those songs are very vulnerable. They're very he's hurting, right? He's just he doesn't know what the hell's going on, and the first time in my life I can see I can see clearly, right? Like all this other stuff has been been just really taxing on me, but it's also. Go ahead.
And you didn't even mention "It's So Hard," which is literally a song about how hard life is. And just try to Mm-hmm.
So, and then you've got like the angry stuff, like "I don't want to be a soldier," like the political stuff, and "Give me some truth," like that. I kept waiting. I was wondering, if Lennon did this later on, maybe he'd be, because I kept waiting for him to go, like, just drop "motherfucker," like so many super motherfuckers go. Like he didn't do it though. He was just doing tricky dicks and all this other stuff. But he's angry. He's like frustrated and angry at just like politicians and like people just doing them wrong and doing the world wrong and stuff. So I don't know. To me, this is it's like in some respects, it's the second installment of the previous record, sugar coated a little bit.
That sounds right.
So I like this. I think that there's some great songs on here. "Crippled Inside," that's like, I think Lennon's trying to do the band there. I mean, it sounds like that should be on a band record, and it's just this old timey kind of ragtime piano going on, very upbeat, very catchy, lot of fun. "Jealous Guy," that's a beautiful song. Like that piano part. You do have the Spectre echo. I don't mind it as much. I don't mind Spectre on this as much as I have on other stuff that he's done. But that's a very pretty song. "I Don't Want to Be a Soldier Mama" it's a little long, but it's cool sounding, right? I like the effects that they're doing there. It's a little monotonous, but I like the full band stuff that's going on there. It's very interesting musically. The only song on here that I really don't care for too much is "How," and I think it reminds me of, like, I hear Spector's production there in the same way that I hear what he did with "The Long and Winding Road." It's like the over orchestration, which is just like, I don't know if it needs that. It's lyrically, I do like it, and but it's not. I don't know, musically it's a little bit boring for me. But then, it kicks back into "Oh Yoko," which is just like this really upbeat, catchy, song as well. So, I really did like this. I didn't know, I think I knew a lot of the songs here and there, but probably half the record I didn't know at all. But I liked it. And as far as "Imagine" goes, to me, I like the melody of that. I love especially the bridge, the piano part that he's doing with the bridge, where he's like, "You may say I'm a dreamer and I'm not the only," like that chord progression is very interesting. I've always liked that. I get why people slag on it. They're like, "Oh, it's Lennon's being hypocritical. Imagine no possessions yet." If you ever see the video from this, it's like, I'm in this huge house with, with this like amazingly like expensive piano and, and all on this estate, But Lennon always said that, the idea behind "Imagine" is in order for us to get to a better place in the world, we have to start with imagining what that could look like, So he's not like telling people to do all these things. He's just like, start here, just imagine what this could be, and maybe then we could start to make a change. So people want to. I think you're right, John. It is the fashionable thing to shit on. But I did find a quote here from one of my favorite, more modern artists, Frank Turner, who did. He did AV Club for a number of years had a segment called Hate Song, where they would have an artist come on and they would pick a song that they hated, and Frank Turner picked "Imagine." And one of the quotes that I really liked, he says, "I think one of the things that grinds for me, though, is the way it's kind of a fallback, quote, favorite song, unquote, for people who don't have any interest in music. It's a default setting for the tasteless." I'd respect people much more if they just said, you know what, I really don't care about music, rather than pick this song as a favorite. It's so beige.
So says the guy whose big song is a song that goes, hey, 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 give a little bit about rock and roll. You know, like it's
That's
just kind
not
of
how
Rich
that goes.
coming. It's just kind of like Rich coming from, you know, like a guy that wrote big, broad songs like that. I'll defend it because John Lennon was pretty ballsy in his era. You know what I mean? Like he was constantly pissing people off, which is a trait that people don't do. People are controversial without being controversial anymore. John Lennon was like legitimately controversial at a time when he could have played it safe and not been controversial. And that is something I've always respected about John Lennon. He truly did go the road not taken, you know? And so I give him a pass on Imagine, even though it's kind of cheesy because it's, you know what I mean? It's real from a guy who suffered as much trauma as he did. You know what I mean? I think it is heartfelt from him. It's been you know, taken and, you know, prostituted by folks that didn't come from that era and kind of wanted to make it universalized as opposed to like a personal statement. But can we talk about I Don't Want to Be a Soldier, Mama? Because I don't know if there's ever been a more Phil Spector production song than that.
Right.
And that's like, it's like right up there with the girl groups in the 60s. In terms of production, but it's so hard, right? That it almost sounds country-ish at times.
No,
Yeah.
wait, It's So Hard. I thought that was more blues to me.
I wrote bluesy and twangy guitar.
Okay.
Yeah, it felt like almost like
cool.
country-ish to me, which is the closest I've ever seen, you know, Lennon get that way. Like I said, Oh Yoko is like modern indie. I like that he was dabbling in all these different genres. Crippled Inside, by the way, is a really good song lyrically, and I like the way it sounds. Like when you hear the lyrics, you know what I mean? And you see that title, you'd think it would sound one way, but it sounds a different way, but it's just as profound the way it sounds. It gets across the idea of being crippled inside, but in a different way than how you'd think it would sound if you were scoring it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. The beginning of that song reminds me of Don't Pass Me By. It sounds very similar in my when I was listening to that.
Yeah, it's just, to me, it was kind of one of those songs I was like, it's a little bit of a surprise because it's very different for a Lennon song, you know, to kind of go in that old timey, you know, type thing. But yeah, I mean, you're right, John. There's a good amount of variety here, and it's very solid. I don't know if I would say it's better than Plastic Ono Band. I think that's probably an overall stronger. It's definitely the strongest songs on that album are definitely better than the strongest songs on this record, I think. I also think it's interesting how that first record ends with God, where he's basically like, I don't believe in anything, and then like it's the next album starts with Imagine, which means I believe in anything that's possible, you know. So it's like a total. And also the interesting thing with Imagine is that Yoko in 2017, at the same time that it got nominated or voted as the Song of the Century, who was that? It was by the National Music Publishers Association, so they were the ones that did that. And then, but they also credited Ono with a co-writing credit for that, because Lennon later said he's like, I should have given her credit for it because the main messages from that were inspired by a book of poems and writings that she had done back in like the early mid '60s, in this book called Grapefruit, which was very it left a big impression on Lennon. So she had words like imagine in there, imagine this, imagine that, and he kind of ran with that for the song. So it's a lot of people were saying that that's a song where Lennon was, Yoko was speaking through John, because a lot of that was like her messaging, and that was her part of her influence on him.
That does make sense. I could see that.
Yeah,
Interesting.
Yeah, so sounds like we have some, all pretty fairly solid thumbs up here.
Yeah.
Couple of things here, so just to finish up, because this is the last time we're covering John Lennon, and it's one of, I would say, the saddest, most tragic events in like all of music history. What happens to him? But he does, like I said, he does do a couple more albums. He goes on that. Yoko and Lennon take like a 18-month hiatus or break from their relationship, that's Lennon's famed Lost Weekend, where he gets drunk and stoned and hangs out with Harry Nilsson and gets thrown out of clubs for heckling the Smothers Brothers and stuff like that. But they do get back together. They have a kid, and for 5 years he's being a father, and then he starts with a new album in 1980. It's like Reborn, right? And so So as he started to promote that record, less than a month after it's released, on December 8th, he was shot and killed outside of his apartment in New York City. Earlier that day, he was actually photographed by Rolling Stone photographer Annie Leibovitz, and that picture made the photos that she took from that made their way onto the issue of Rolling Stone that was released after his death. The famous photo from that is where Yoko's on the floor and Lennon's naked, kind of with his leg draped over her, kissing her. So that photo was taken on the afternoon of his death. He was interviewed gave a final interview to a San Francisco DJ. After that, and then he went to the studio. He signed a number of autographs for fans outside of his apartment on the way to the studio. One of which was the actual man that shot him. He signs that guy's rec album, and Mark David Chapman, and then he stands outside the apartment for like 6 hours or whatever. And then when Lennon shows up, he does shoot him 5 times in the back. He was basically dead within 10 minutes. They rushed him to the hospital, and the death was actually made known to most of the nation. Oh, do you guys know this? This is an interesting trivia. John,
No.
John, are you familiar?
Was it on SNL?
No, it was close. It was Monday Night Football.
Monday Night Football. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, it was towards the end of the game, and Howard Cosell actually made the announcement, which is how most of the world or the nation really found out about Lennon's death. After the death, the album re-entered the charts, peaking at number 5 in the UK and number 63 in the US. And John Lennon was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame a second time in 1994. So yeah, every time, if you guys, and it's I read the whole the Wikipedia page on like the events leading up to the death and just what happened in the aftermath of it. And it's I don't know, for me as a huge Beatles fan, as a huge Lennon fan, as a musician and a person, I mean, he obviously was a flawed person, not the nicest at times, but he did an immense amount for music and for people, still to this day. And like, you read through all that stuff and it's like, holy crap, like just one crazy guy, who oddly enough, one of the reasons he gave for the act was, being angry at Lennon for being hypocritical for something like Imagine, where he's saying, imagine no possessions, yet he's got all this stuff, or, just things that he saw that he didn't like him saying that they were bigger than Jesus when he was with the Beatles, and, just little things like that set him off. But, very tragic. Mark David Chapman still is in jail. He's been denied parole for like 11 different times, and he's probably going to be there for the rest of his life. So very, very sad ending to this, but lots of music to always go back to. And it was good going over this, because there was a lot of the stuff on this album I didn't really know before. So
yeah, it must have been shocking to be there, or hear it in person that he was killed. That would have been one of those cultural moments that, unlike now, like everyone would have been aware of and a part of. And probably,
there probably would have been like video streaming on Facebook or whatever. Yeah. But like you said, he ended on a positive note. He left a long discography of music you can listen to. Yeah, I always wonder what he would have done. Like, it kept. Like, I think Yoko at one time said, I think he was really on the he liked being on the edge of things. So she's like, I could see him getting into hip hop, and I was like, oh really?
Yeah.
I don't know about that. I don't know if that would have been a good thing, but
Well, Paul McCartney did, in fairness, right, with Kanye.
I guess he did, right? Did he didn't rap on that though, did he?
No, I don't see John Lennon rapping either.
Yeah.
I think he had a little more self-awareness than that. But yeah.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah.